I shall get going if that is okay. Um, it's nice to see everybody. Thank you for taking the time. Appreciate it's a Friday and people have lots of things going on at all times at the moment. We decided to do this, I guess, partly because um, as an organization, we try and have always tried to positively involve ourselves in the policy discussion. Those of you who know Jane Ashworth, our founder, really well, will know that this is something she's particularly passionate about, is influencing the way that all political parties, governments, local authorities of all persuasions think about policy, and particularly in relation, obviously, from our perspective, to children and young people and to sport and physical activity and all the benefits that that brings. So I'm going to start with a health warning. Obviously, what I'm going to share this morning is not a political view of street games. We don't hold strong political persuasive views. We can't as a charity. We have to remain apolitical. So what I've tried to do in what I've just pulled together here is be incredibly objective and just share what we're seeing. And then the second stage of that is probably talking from our own perspective as an organisation about some of the things that we would like to see happen. So the way that we're going to make the hour work today to get the best of it, I'm going to share a little bit, as I say, of what we know, share a little bit about our current thinking and approach as an organisation, but then really very keen to hear what you all know and think, your perspective and anything you feel we should consider. Obviously, that doesn't just have to happen when I'm finished making the presentation. Feel free to use the chat as we normally would, and there's a Q&A function on this version of Teams. So if you want to, as we're going through, as I'm just sharing some of the information, if you want to put questions into that we can all talk about, that would be great. I hope you know us well enough, me well enough, those of you who've met me previously, to know that absolutely feel comfortable to share your thoughts with the group. I think the only thing we'd ask of everybody is we've all got our own personal views about which party we're going to put across in the box for, I imagine, on the 4th of July. But we just need to try and avoid party political comments because we are going to share this webinar more broadly with other organisations we work with. So any of your own political views, if we can keep those for another day, that would be great. And as I said, we are recording this just to share with others who wanted to be in the session but couldn't make it. So I thought what would be really helpful was a World Health Organization conference this week, and this slide popped up that I thought, oh, that's the best explanation I think I've ever seen about why policy, and we're talking about policy this afternoon, is important in and of itself. And the thing that this person from the World Health Organization shared were these kind of 8 aspects to policy, in that obviously with any issue, it raises the visibility and priority of any issue if it is included in policy. For governments, for local authorities, for other bodies, it provides that framework for action and helps to guide the allocation of resources. And in some cases, and appreciating the current state of the economy, it may not be the case after this election, it can lead to increased investment. So policy, those top 4 things really about providing that framework and then being the way that resources are allocated, investment is made. What it does on the other side of that in terms of implementation is it can increase the consistency in the approach that's taken across the country. So by government setting policy, it can mean that the 151 top tier authorities and the 300 plus lower tier authorities can then have a more consistent view about what's expected of them. It offers us all an opportunity to support collaboration, and importantly, I think it should be used as a tool, I think, policy to hold government and other stakeholders to account. If we're making statements about what's important and what we feel needs to be done to address challenges or take opportunities, then both holding government and other stakeholders to account, but supporting monitoring and evaluation of effectiveness is the other side, if you like, of the policy picture. So that's the kind of frame, I suppose, that I just wanted to use today. I know everybody comes with a slightly different starting point when it comes to policy, but hopefully that just helps people to think about what we're talking about here. And the current policy landscape, when we look at a starting point at sports, we obviously had the launch of the government's Get Active strategy last August. One of the Street Games members was involved in that, the brilliant North Paddington Youth Club, where they were involved in the launch. But as well as the government strategy, we also have other policy documents in the Vision for Sport in Wales, for any colleagues who are there from Wales, and then the Sport Wales strategy that follows that. And then obviously, for those of us operating and working in England, Uniting the Movement sets out the vision and some of the policy from a Sport England perspective, building upon what government had in its Sporting Future strategy for 2015. Now, those are the existing policy documents, but what's influencing what's going to happen in the future is really interesting. So one of the types of documents that come out before elections often are the kinds of documents that think tanks produce. And this one, many of you may have seen, the Healthy Britain report that the Fabian Society produced around a new approach to health and well-being. This is undoubtedly influencing Labour's thinking around policy and has been led by an MP, Kim Ledbetter, who many of you may well know, who's the current chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Sport. And then on the other side of that kind of think tank approach, some of you may have seen the sports think tank document, The Road to the 2024 Election Manifesto. And this was something that lots of organisations in the sports sector contributed to and has been used by the sports think tank to influence the thinking of all parties. So all parties are being shared the kind of policy ideas that sport physical activity wants to bring to bear. And I've just attached the links on there for those of you who'd like to have further looks at those as two examples. The usual caveat of other think tank documents are available. So moving on then, just to give a little bit of an overview, if that was about the current policy landscape, the things that the parties are using to influence their thinking and their manifestos, this is a broad view around the two main parties. Now, I started off by doing all 7 of the major national parties and realised, as several people have said recently, whatever happens in the election, one of these 2 parties will form the government as we understand it with the current state of the polls. So just sticking to what the Conservatives and Labour are saying at a headline level, and then I'll just touch on what they're saying about sport and what they're saying about children and young people. So the Conservative manifesto, as it says here, is talking about sticking to the plan that they're already on the path of delivering, taking bold actions to secure the future of the nation, supporting working people, stronger economy, and safeguarding the borders and national security. And the document itself is broken down into 16 chapters, which covers a range of specific issues, mainly aligned to government departments. So obviously, where you've got welfare, you've got the Department for Work and Pensions, you've got justice around the Home Office and MOJ and so on. And within that, as you'll see in a moment, they've touched on particular commitments that they want to make in sport and particular commitments that affect the lives of children and young people. So that's the Conservative position. The Labour starting point is obviously that they have their 5 missions, which they launched at their party conference back in 2022, I think. I'm thinking back. It was a 22 rather than 23. Those are on the screen there for you. The ones that probably most impact the kind of work that organisations we work with are the ones around taking back our streets and raising confidence. Breaking down barriers to opportunity is the really significant one. I think no class ceiling on the ambitions of young people in Britain. And then obviously, as they're talking about building an NHS fit for the future, as you'll see, they're also talking about some of the preventative aspects of health. Again, I'm not going to read through every single line on here. What is interesting when you look at the two-party manifestos is obviously, with the Conservatives being the party of government, they have a number of current programs that they're investing in that they talk about in their manifesto. So in the middle of that, you'll see they're talking about further investment into multi-sport grassroots facilities, which is part of the work they're already doing, continuing the work that they're doing with the Lionesses Futures Fund around women and girls and equal access to football. What they have added into their manifesto, which is new, is to move from guidance around 2 hours of PE in primary and secondaries to being mandatory about 2 hours of PE every week in primary and secondary schools, and to extend the PE and sport premium, which you'll remember they introduced for primary schools to support those children and young people, particularly who might be primary premium, but all children in primary schools. And they're proposing to extend that to secondary schools, and then to also increase the existing funding for school games organisers to do more around competitive sport. Labour's commitments to sport in their manifesto are less detailed. They're very broad in terms of protecting time for physical education and supporting access to grassroots clubs. And then also they're promising to deliver international events that will inspire a next generation and improve healthy living. For those of you who are football fans, I realise not everybody is, but it's a topic of the moment. Both have committed to continuing the work that's already started around football governance and around the regulator and the involvement of football fans. There are lots of manifesto commitments that touch on the lives of young people. We've picked a few out here that feel like they may be relevant in the context of organisations we work with. So clearly for the Conservatives, the work that's ongoing around school attendance and improving mental health support to reduce school absence is a major priority. You'll have all seen, because it's been a big topic in the press, the idea around reinventing national service for young people who are 18 to give them life skills and build a stronger culture. The Family Hubs program, sorry, that's a tongue twister. The Family Hubs program that's currently in 75 local authorities, the proposal is to both expand it from being predominantly early years focused to being all the way from when children start in the early years until they reach adulthood, and for that program to be evident in every local authority. So as I say, it's currently in 75. The plan is to expand it. And the restrictions of advertising on high salt, fat, sugar products to tackle the childhood obesity issue. The mental health support teams that many of you be aware are already in many schools around the country will be increased. And even though there's not much detail at this point, there's a clear commitment to early support hubs for 11 to 25-year-olds in every community by the end of the decade. Labour's children and young people commitments fall into different areas of their mission. So particularly clear is their statement in the piece around crime and social behaviour around young futures hubs. Some of you may have heard Yvette Cooper actually launched these at Labour Party conference in the autumn of 2023. But the idea is that the hubs will have youth workers, mental health workers, careers advisors, and will be in local communities. They've said, I think at this point, up to 90 initially of these hubs to support young people. But alongside that, they're talking in their manifesto around local prevention partnerships and very specific funded recommendations around placing youth workers and mentors into places like accident and emergency units and pupil referral units. Their statement around the health of young people is very broad. So this ambition to raise the healthiest generation of children ever. There isn't much policy detail in the manifesto around what they'll do around that, but just referring back to my point about how think tanks influence government party manifestos, one of the things that Labour have said is that they'll tackle the social determinants of health, halving the gap in healthy life expectancy. And this issue, obviously, that Street Games is concerned about around those areas of poorer health and inequality. The social determinants of health, which I'm sure you've all heard before as well, is very much language that's used by Michael Marmot. And Michael Marmot was involved both in his own reports and his review that he wrote of his 10-year report, but also in shaping some of the thinking around the Healthy Britain document that the Fabian Society produced. For our colleagues from Wales as well, one of the commitments Labour have put in their manifesto is to work with the Welsh Labour government to consider the devolution of youth justice. So at the moment, youth justice is centrally held. It's not a devolved responsibility, but they're talking about devolving it should they be elected. That gives you a bit of a fly through. I appreciate we did say we try and keep the presenting to a minimum. I just wanted to share a little bit about what we as Street Games have done in this sphere. Some of you who may have been along to our network meetings in the autumn last year, we launched a 5-point manifesto as Street Games, so very, very brief, but it's very focused on you, the organisations we work with, obviously, and the young people we're concerned about. So that's the image that you'll see if you look on the website. What we've done here is just really simplify the asks that we're making as an organisation. So the first one, which I think we'd all recognise, is the importance of unlocking funding for prevention. And obviously, from our point of view, that's through sport. So whilst there is no new money or very little new money in the system at the moment, we've proposed that through using the Social Value Act, any incoming government or any existing and staying government could do more to unlock funding for prevention that could then be devolved to those working in local areas. Clearly, there's a need to invest in safe places for young people to be active in their communities. We've talked about these as active well-being hubs. So the idea that partners work together, like many of you already do, in communities to provide in the most disadvantaged areas, safe places for young people to be active. The importance for us of listening to the learnings of our locally trusted organisations and involving them in the way that policy is implemented. And I didn't just add this because you're here, Chris, but we did say as well as academics, because a lot of the work we've done over recent years has been about academics sharing a perspective that's really important. Engaging trusted leaders in communities when trying to generate new ideas, and then investing directly into these organizations. So one of the things we've asked in our kind of manifesto is that there's almost a duty on statutory bodies when they're having to commission provision in their local area to really think about the local organizations that can do that delivery. It's not just us, though. You'll have seen, hopefully, some of you this week. We've worked with a group of young people to enable them to produce their own manifesto. It's not a Street Games manifesto, it's absolutely theirs. Some of the things they talk about, we wouldn't dare say as an organisation. So, one of the things in the Young People's Manifesto is about Vote 16. And we definitely don't have a political view on Vote 16. But the work that you all do, and we've been trying hard over the last 4 or 5 years to get even better at, has been about making sure that young people get their voices heard. So please, I've put the link there, do have a look at that. All of this for us is being driven by our 10-year vision, and many of you will have seen our end game and the ambition we have over the 10 years, none of which can be delivered by Street Games as a charity. It all has to be delivered in partnership, but this is always the thing that frames the way that we talk about things. Right, that's me. I've probably gone over slightly longer than I wanted to by about 5 minutes or so. But what I wanted to do now, obviously, is open the floor, opportunity for people to share questions, share ideas, share opinions, and I'll stop the presentation for a moment and give people the chance just to chip in. Happy that if people want to, they use the usual form of Teams for those of you who are used to doing it in terms of using your yellow hands, or just come off. There's a small enough group of us here. If you want to just come off and talk, that's fine as well. Always difficult to get the first one, isn't it? Chris.
I was deliberately holding back because I'm conscious I'm a bit of an outsider in this conversation, but as nobody else is offering to speak, I have a bigger question which I'll hold back for later. But an immediate question, Mark, the current Get Active strategy of the Conservative government, do you have any insight into whether what will be the status of that document for the next sort of 12 to 18 months, assuming that we have a change of government? Do you have any insight into whether that will just be thrown away and ignored, or whether it will be at all relevant for this kind of interim period of political change?
It's a really good question, Chris. I think it's impossible to know for sure. I think my view, what I see in terms of what Labour are saying about their 5 missions and their focus in terms of the big issues they need to address, it's possibly going to take longer for them to make change in the area of sport and physical activity than they will in some of those areas that are in the headlines of their manifesto. I think as well, everything that we hear from talking to Labour politicians suggests that the focus on tackling inequalities that is obviously at the heart of Get Active, as well as the current Sport England strategy, isn't dissonant with their view of what they want to see. I think they want to see, as you'd expect, I guess, of a Labour government, they want to see inequality addressed and tackled. So whether they decide they're going to rewrite the strategy document, policy document in the next 18 months, I don't know. I think there are questions, and I'm really interested to see the answer of this, about what they might do with something like the National Physical Activity Task Force. So I've been privileged to go to a couple of those meetings. And obviously at the moment they're chaired by Lucy Fraser, the DCMS Secretary of State. But what they haven't had is cross-party involvement in terms of what's going on around the table. They've managed to get most of the government departments at quite a senior level in the room, but it has been very much a kind of an instrument of the Conservative government at this stage. So that may be a woolly answer, but
No,
my suspicion is Labour don't have, from what they're saying in their manifesto, I don't think they've got a different policy document sat somewhere that they're going to bring in and implement straight away, would be my view.
Thank you.
Hi, Mark. It's quiet, so I'm just going to add in.
Hi, Jen.
Hi. What I'm really interested in as the policy comes through, as it hits us locally, we still have another political piece to work with locally. And I think I'm really interested in how we manage that influencing and advocacy bit about how they manage some of that in a local place in Somerset, in our case, but it would be the same for everybody around the country, because a lot gets lost in translation from what the manifesto might say versus what lands on the ground. And in Somerset, where Section 114 is likely to be called, unless is actually they try and take all the money and put as little out to service as they can.
Yeah, and I mean this is why I suppose when I said I don't think there'll be new money, I think what you've just described, there could be not just not new money, there could be less money as well in the system. I mean, one of the one of the things we've been trying to do as an organisation, that gap between what gets written at national policy level and what then happens at implementation, often the civil servants within the departments have more of a say in how that translates from one to the other. And the work I suppose Street Games has done in things like the holiday activities and food work and the Ministry of Justice work that we've done in the last 12, 18 months has really been about trying to get in to that space to try and influence the way that the guidance almost that local authorities then receive, which may help. And that stage you've got to. I think the question about what you do when you're in a Section 114, I mean, we've been involved in delivery in Birmingham, which is obviously the biggest Section 114 in the country, and it's just very difficult. I mean, I don't think we're big enough, powerful enough, or influential enough to really make change in that respect. So I think the best we can do, and what we're trying to do, and I think others in the sports sector are trying to do, is really, if policy's written at a national level, try and influence the way that it's implemented in that respect. Does that make sense? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, we've had that issue with wraparound care where we're actually the vast majority of that money has been thrown inwards for people to do things that in exactly the same way, which won't work as it hasn't worked in the past. It's just really frustrating because the money that should be going out for service is not.
Yeah.
So I realise that it's not quite the conversation today, but perhaps it's one for us to keep an eye on as to how we advocate very locally from that national policy level. So that first slide you put up is about how do we use the framework of national policy to really have that conversation much more robustly locally.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, which I know I don't think's come to Somerset yet, if I'm right, but both parties have committed to the ongoing process of devolution. So it will be interesting, I think, over the next few years to see both how that works, because it's been okay when it's been obvious geographies like Greater Manchester and those kinds of things, but also which powers shift from local authority to devolved authority. So just giving an example we know quite well at the moment, in the Northeast, since they created the Northeast Combined Authority, child poverty has become one of the things that sits as a kind of priority at the devolved level rather than at the local authority level. So again, I don't know how it will work with Somerset. I'm not enough of a geography expert, but that will be another dimension, I suspect, as time goes by, that we're all going to have to think about.
Mark, my name's Julie. I'm from Moss Side in Manchester.
Hi, Julie.
Just because it's quite, I think we're all a little bit dumbfounded at the moment. It's like, because, and not to get political at all, where are we going? You know, there isn't going to be, we know there's going to be no new money. It might be distributed differently. And I think we're all waiting a little bit for like, oh, what do you mean? I mean, we run, it's a very small organisation. And sports are one of our vehicles that we use to do youth work. And that's so important. But it's like, even the funding that the Sport England has just launched, it's small, isn't it?
You
know?
Yeah, it's really challenging. Where was I? I was at a conference, an active partnership conference yesterday, and I heard 3 different people say we need proper funding to community organisations like yours, and we need it for 5 to 10 years, not for 6 to 12 months.
Yeah.
And I think anybody who works in the sports sector would feel that's the case. The challenge has been that everything's felt so short term, and I think all we can keep doing collectively is just keep reminding people that your organisation and others like it need secured funding on a long-term basis. It's no good getting bits here and bits there, and certainly from our point of view, we feel really strongly about that. But equally, I know there's other partners on the call. We've got Arch Partnership colleagues and others on the call here who I know will feel the same. So we can just keep raising it and raising it and raising it. But it does feel uncertain. I recognise that. I mean, I'd obviously sit in a national organisation, but it does feel like we're all kind of waiting to see the outcome and the what next. And I suspect whoever wins, I doubt we'll get the firework display and all the great news that we want in the first few
We're
months
not
in
for the youth
any
sector.
case.
We're
Yeah.
not for the youth sector, I don't believe. And because although I personally believe we are the most important, one of the most important sectors, because we're the voice of the future. Our young people are the voice of the future, and that doesn't, I don't feel by either party that's been taken on. But
No.
that's just my view.
I am, I suppose what always happens with an election as well is that a lot of these documents are being written for the people who are going to have the pencil in their hand on the 4th of July. And I agree with you. I mean, I think back to 97 and it was like education, education, education. It was all young people focused. I don't think any of the parties have, when I look across the manifestos, I agree with you. I don't think anybody's grabbed the future and young people and said this needs to be front and center of what we're talking about here. So that challenge will be ongoing, I suspect.
Mark, we've got a question in the chat from Chris. What role for responsible business investment and philanthropy?
Hopefully huge, Chris, should be the answer. I mean, it's interesting. I don't know what others may have a perspective on this, but our conversations with corporate organisations are that, thanks for coming, our conversation with corporate organisations is that they don't feel they're being rewarded for investing in charity or in that kind of work. Whereas in the past, it might have given them positive recognition from government or something like that. The kind of altruism that comes with corporate social responsibility or funding and donating to charities, a lot of organisations we speak to just feel like they don't get any credit for it. And I know we would prefer it if they all then just did it anyway, but I do think that's part of it. I think the philanthropy one is really interesting. The amount of funding just for sport in kind of charitable giving and those kinds of things is really small as a proportion of the overall fund. So our fundraising director, if he was here, I think would say it's about 2% of philanthropic giving goes to sport, but then it's something like 25% of philanthropic giving goes to young people. And to Julie's point, I guess it's about what can we do collectively to encourage that kind of giving into young people and the needs of young people. We haven't, as a charity, found a way to crack it. I'd be interested to hear if anybody else has found a way to do it. But again, I'm not sure there's enough incentives in the system at the moment for a lot of potential philanthropists to want to give money, and certainly not to give the kind of money that would really make change at a local level. Sorry, Chris, I'm sure you've got your own view on that as well.
Well, no, I don't really have anything more to add. I just threw that into the chat because, for the same very simple reason that public funding, as other people have already said, is under immense pressure, isn't it? And therefore, looking for alternative sources of funding is going to be even more important than it has been in the past.
The one bright light, I don't want to sound all doom and gloom actually, is I think the Social Value Act, which came into force in 2022, which basically means that through any public procurement, so any time that a local authority or the NHS or the police or anybody like that spends money, buys things, services and goods, there has to be a social value aspect to that. Now it's still being developed. It's some organisations are very good at it and have a social value action plan that leads to more opportunities for jobs or those kinds of things. But there is, in that respect, when the private sector are bidding for big contracts to provide, let's pick one I know nothing about, helicopters to the police, there is a social value spend part of that contract now. And that may be one of the ways that we can unlock corporate funding in a way that maybe hasn't been there before. So a few more opportunities like that would be very welcome, I think. Laura, hello.
Hi. So I think my question, it links really nicely into what's come up around funding and around, regardless of what party's going to be in, there's not going to be any more money. It's about being clever. And I think I'd be really interested to know what your thoughts are from the manifestos about a community asset-based approach, and about how going forward, organisations like yourselves, I'm based in Birmingham, so I work for a fairly large organisation, how we can work together to encourage communities to create what they want. So we're not doing it to and for them, we're doing it with them, or they're doing it themselves, because that's realistically, the money isn't going to get any easier. And even if we get 5-year pots, that's great, but 5 years is still only 5 years. And if we can get these communities, or we can support these communities to create something they want, how it then makes it more sustainable, because you've got buy-in, you've got long-term social value to it. And it thinking about kind of the policies and where StreetGames sit, what insight do you have, or what are your feelings?
Yeah, I mean, I'll pick one example. Like I talked about the Young Futures hubs that are in the Labour manifesto. Now, I would immediately say, to your point, and probably to what Julie was saying earlier, you shouldn't build a new building in a community and call it a Young Futures hub. You shouldn't be looking to bring in lots of new staff and create a Young Futures hub. You should be working alongside the community in an asset-based way with organisations and individuals they already trust, because apart from anything else, that'll be the way to successfully deliver what you want to see happen. Now, that's always challenging politically, because I think we all know that politicians like cutting ribbons on shiny new facilities, but that would be the bit that we would advocate for is, yes, that may be the right policy goal, but in order to achieve that for young people, you need to do that in an asset-based way. So I think it will be about trying to match up what the ambitions are and what the challenges are that the government sees at a policy level, and the way that they implement them, which, to your point, Laura, should be in an asset-based way, not in a top-down, here's the new building that you're getting kind of way. Now, there's no doubt that that's hard, because that isn't the way often that politicians work. But I think we can probably share lots of examples of where that does work now. And the other thing that I think is interesting is the whole move to place-based working, which I know is a bit of a buzz phrase, but increasingly, certainly in sport, I think give Sport England a huge amount of credit for doing this, starting with what a community wants through some of their place work that they've done in areas, and building from that. And some of the work that the integrated care boards and the integrated care systems are being challenged around. What do you know about what your community really needs and wants, and what is the best way to get there? I don't for 1 second say that we're anywhere near there yet, but I do think everything's pushing towards a recognition of asset-based work. And the final thing I would say is there's a really interesting pamphlet called The Preventative State. Duncan, can you do me a favour and dig it out? It's on the Demis website, which talks about how if we haven't got enough money in the public sector anymore, and if actually the public sector, all it's doing is dealing with the problems that we have, so it's fixing people in hospital, it's having to deal with acute mental health issues, it's having to sadly put people into prison, we need to rethink how we deliver services to people, and particularly young people, and that should be about a community asset based approach. So I'm a big fan. It's only a short pamphlet, it's worth a read. I don't know how much it's influencing people's thinking, but I think the more people that talk about it, the more it may, because the future is definitely community and asset based. Thank you, Duncan. And it's there in the chat if you want to have a look.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks.
Chris, sorry, put myself on
No, I
mute.
think
It's not
Julie's
brief.
first.
Oh, sorry, Julie. Got my
No,
numbers the wrong way
it's all
round.
right. Doesn't matter. I just want to follow on from what you've been saying. I mean, we have a great example trying to involve our local businesses. We've had funding from the Royal Foundation and funding apparently from our Greater Manchester Mayor's office. It's not come through yet. We've been waiting 8 or 9 months now, and it's for us to work with young people and local businesses. Local businesses will put funding in as well, but we're still banging our heads with our GMCA workers, basically, because they do not understand the asset based. That's my personal belief, and I think that's what we've got to get across. So what you've just sent, I think, is really useful, because it's reminded me things like that I might send to them. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I think as well, our learning from like the commissioning bit of local authorities, that's the bit that I feel like our job is to try and get inside the heads of. Like we've done some of that in Greater Manchester with the police and crime work, where we've actually persuaded the violence reduction unit to let us help them give the money out so that it comes out quicker and easier and those kinds of things. But there's so many places where, as you say, you've got commissioners who should be giving you funding quickly, and they don't realise that you need it for cash flow. Because if you work in a huge, great bureaucratic organisation, you never have to think about whether you've got enough money in the bank. So if it takes 9 months, that's not an issue if you work in a local authority. But it's those kinds of things like payment in advance and all those kinds of things that I think we and others who work nationally need to be still reminding them. And the more you're reminding them as well, hopefully eventually we'll get the message across. You reminded me of something actually that I think is potentially really interesting in the devolution deals, and particularly for young people. I think because economic growth is probably at the top of all parties' agenda, I think there will be more resources into looking at how young people can be supported with employability and the things that get in the way of them getting into jobs and into apprenticeships and into those sorts of things. And I think that may well come through where they exist at a devolved authority level. So
that's really interesting, Mark, because that is what we're trying to do, and they don't realise I've got to get them out of bed first.
Yes.
Before we get into an apprenticeship. And I keep saying that to them, and they keep saying. So that's really interesting that it's happening at a higher level. So
yeah, I think it's being realised that a lot of the people who aren't, well, a lot of the adults who aren't working, obviously, it's down to mental health difficulties in a lot of cases. And there are other reasons, I appreciate, but that's the reason why a lot of people are signed off from not working. So with young people, that getting them out of bed and getting them to a place where they feel they can engage in work or learning or training or whatever it is, I think is a really big issue, and one that we'll keep pushing as well. Thanks, Julie. Chris.
Yeah. Okay. I think I'm fairly confident in saying that I'm probably the oldest person on this call, which is possibly a strength and possibly a weakness. So that's context for what I'm about to say. The thought and the question that's in my mind, Mark, it's it possibly goes beyond the scope of this particular conversation, because I'm conscious that the focus of this is around children, young people, disadvantage, all of that, the street games territory. But it's, I think it's definitely relevant to that, but possibly has a broader context and application. Sorry, I'm conscious I'm waffling. Let me just read out the question that's in my mind, and then if necessary, I'll explain why I think it might be both relevant and important in the context of the politics of our country at the moment. So here's my question. Is sport development in all its forms still a recognised and credible sub-discipline of the sports sector in the way that it arguably was several decades ago? If so, how is it defined? Is there a consensus? If not, does there need to be? And what role for good, and I stress the word good, arguably great theory? Now, some of you might be thinking, what, or is he going off on one here? And maybe I am. So I'm conscious, I'm open to the accusation that this is a red herring. I'd like to try and convince you that it isn't. And where I'm coming from, Mark, here, and I'm not saying it's all about this, I think you're aware that I've been having conversations recently with a number of very, very credible people around the concept of sporting capital. Are you aware of that? Yeah,
I am. Yep.
So the people I'm talking about, not in any order of priority, Nick Rowe, who actually is the author and the creator of Sporting Capital as a theory of sport participation and sport development, but also some current practitioners, including Keris, your own Keris, Nigel Harrison, Chief Executive of Yorkshire Sport Foundation, Martin Allison, very, very experienced, semi-retired local government professional. And what we're trying to do through this work is to educate and inform policymakers and practitioners about what we consider to be the potential of sporting capital as a theory and as an approach, as a model, to provide a unifying, that's the key word, a unifying approach to sport development. So that's a bit of a ramble. I'll just throw it out there because I thought this is an interesting group of people. I wonder if anybody has any immediate thoughts on that, and feel free to kick back if you think I'm talking nonsense.
God, I have loads of thoughts on that. I'll give you some initial thoughts. I think there's a very real challenge around the recognition and credibility of sport development in a world where we are talking increasingly broadly about the definition of sport. So Uniting the Movement for me is a really interesting document in that when you look at some of the big visible successes that are being talked about now, they can be talked about in the spheres of active travel, physical activity and movement for older people, neither of which in my mind are what Sport for Good, Sport for Development delivers. They're very valid, they're very important, they're important to different sectors of the population, but I have a fear that the shrinking of sport development or sport for development staff in places like local authorities means that there's almost a need to re-establish sports development or sport for development as a thing. Now, it may not sit in local authorities, but it definitely feels like it needs to be defined because the inequalities that exist for young people in sport go beyond whether or not they're able to walk or cycle to school. It's about whether they actually have access to sport that improves their lives. And in terms of sporting capital, as you know, Street Games has always been huge fan of the Duncan. Can you maybe find Sporting Capital online and just drop it in the chat? It's Nick Rowe's there's a book, but there's some papers as well. I think Sporting Capital, given the focus on physical literacy and positive experiences that certainly in England is what Sport England and others have been working on, I think Sporting Capital is really important subset of that broader thinking about physical literacy. And it almost feels like the sports bit, if you want to call it that, of the physical literacy paradigm and picture.
Can I come back on that, Mark? Can I come back
Yeah.
on that? Because then there's an important point. I would say it's the other way around.
Okay.
And this is the holistic nature of Sporting Capital. I'm conscious there's people on the call who won't have a Scooby-Doo what I'm talking about here, because you may not have been exposed to Sporting Capital, and that's part of the challenge. But when you look at the model and you understand the model, you will see that it is holistic, and that the scope of it and the thinking behind it is actually broader, I would argue, and I think Nick would as well, than physical literacy. There are definitely important synergies, but I think it's, with the greatest respect, I think it's the other way round rather than physical literacy, rather than the way you described it.
Yeah, and I understand why it would be seen that way. We better not get into this debate because it's going to take us away from the policy piece. But I mean, I think the point that for me links to the policy piece is we cannot afford to lose sports development, sport for development, within the wider discussion about movement, physical activity, and sport. And I feel like there is a real risk to it at the moment in terms of it being recognised, being credible, and I would always say great theory, you cannot do without it. When it was on my slides.
Can I just say one other thing? I'm conscious, the time and all that. One of the things that has frustrated me, and I don't mean this as any disrespect to the people who've been working really hard in trying to influence government policy. So I'm talking particularly about the Sports Think manifesto here. One of the things that's frustrated me about that, and others, I have to say, that I've been working with, is that it comes across as a bit of a series of asks from different sort of interest groups within the sector. It's not particularly unified. And when you're presenting, like trying to present things to government, the danger is they'll just cherry pick stuff. I hope I'm explaining that right. It's not as joined up as perhaps it could have been. I mean,
I think that sums up in some ways some of the topics we've had on this call today, is that everybody in sport and in the wider children, young people, youth world has a really clear view about what they think is important. I think what's really challenging is us coming behind a number of simple, clear asks that everyone supports, because the reason I think it's easy to, at a policy level, to cherry pick is because every organisation has a slightly different view of what they want to see from a sports perspective, and so part of why we're doing these sessions is to share our perspective, I suppose, from an organisational perspective, but really to look for more consensus and unification. Like some of you will have seen, there's a big campaign called Take the Lead around making the UK the most active nation in Europe. Now, it's not flawless, but it's the kind of thing where everybody could feel connected to a national message about sport, physical activity. But then the challenge is always, beneath that sits hundreds of organisations, thousands of individuals who all have a slightly different take on it. So it's the right ambition. It's how you do it, I think, is the question.
No, thanks. Well, thanks for listening to me. Appreciate it.
Not at all. Conscious of time, we've got about 6 minutes left. I'm keen to make sure that if you've 5 minutes, I've just been told on my screen. If you've got anything to share beyond what we've already talked about. Otherwise, what I was just going to do quickly was come back to the presentation, because this isn't the end. There are opportunities beyond this to get into further conversation. I'm really interested that if people have got really strong views on anything we've talked about today or anything else in relation to policy, please do just share them directly with me, because we're constantly developing what we do in this area and are always keen to hear from those people and organisations that matter the most, because they're doing the most to change young lives on the ground. Many of you will already be in touch with our area colleagues, but I've put the link into our area teams as well, because they will also be able to talk to you about more of the localized work that we may be doing with politicians and on policy. I think it's worth saying that there's a really quite a positive opportunity with whoever is in government on the 5th of July to do some further work, because we know the spending review is going to take place in the autumn. It's going to start in August and finish in November, December. So certainly when I talked about earlier how we try and influence through civil servants and others the ways that policy is implemented, we'll continue to positively do that. So we will do a big push on protecting investment in young people's holidays, for example. Doesn't have to be in the same form it's in now, but the holidays for young people are such a time of inequality when schools and other services just aren't around. We'll be joining forces with a number of organisations inside and outside the sports sector to really push hard on protecting resources that come in for holiday provision. And then just from a Street Games perspective, we're going to be doing a session that will be led by John Downs, who's our youth sector director and leads on a lot of our work across the North East, Yorkshire and North West on engaging local politicians. That will be on Tuesday the 16th of July. And we're also doing a webinar where you'll be able to hear directly from the young people who put the Youth Manifesto together. Didn't dare do them together because they'd have completely upstaged me and I wouldn't have been able to say anything. No, I'm joking. They are brilliant, and actually there'll be a great opportunity if you want to hear how they develop the Youth Manifesto, what's important to them. We'll be sharing the date for that shortly. I'll just stop sharing my screen. We've got couple of minutes left. Have we got any final questions or comments that people would like to share? Thank you, Lynn. Appreciate you attending as well. I hope it has been useful. And let's carry on the conversation. And I'll Chris, is that a legacy hand? Was that,
I had a great quote that might be a nice way to finish. I went to a conference last week where this really impressive young man was speaking, and he said, and I quote, "Young people, let me get this right. Young people are absolutely not the future. Young people are not the future in any way. They are the present, and they need to be listened to."
That's a brilliant finish.
I just thought that was. I love the counterintuitive nature of that. So just share that with you.
Thank you. Lynn. Oh, she's gone. Brilliant. That is the best place to finish. I wish you all a fantastic weekend and look forward to speaking to some of you soon.
Bye. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Bye-bye.